This is the story of how the Roman Empire collapsed under the weight of a mathematical problem it couldn't solve, and why the United States is approaching that same economic threshold in 2026. America turns 250 years old on July 4th, 2026, which happens to be the exact lifespan that a controversial historical theory claims marks the end of empires. Current projections show the US government will be spending more money paying interest on its debt than defending its borders. Currency debasement took the Romans from 95% silver coins to 2% over 4 centuries, and since 2008, the Federal Reserve has expanded its balance sheet by 7 times. The parallels are striking, and the question becomes whether they actually mean anything for America's future. Rome was burning in the year 64 AD, and 10 of 14 districts had been consumed by flames when Emperor Nero faced a financial crisis that would change monetary history. His solution was to debase the currency. Silver content in the denarius, Rome's primary coin, dropped by approximately 10 to 14% at Nero's command, making him the first Roman emperor to deliberately debase currency as official policy. Purity had held steady at 95 to 98% since the coin's introduction around 211 BC, and that stability would never return. What's essential to understand is that Nero didn't destroy Rome's currency in one decision, and the debasement unfolded gradually over more than 400 years. Augustus maintained 98% silver in his coins. Trajan dropped that to 80 to 85% by 98 AD. Marcus Aurelius brought it down to 75%, and Septimius Severus around 200 AD pushed it to 40-50% silver. By 270 AD, under Claudius II, the denarius had become base metal with just 2% silver content. Economic consequences hit hard. Wine prices exploded by approximately 6,300% from Augustus to Diocletian's era, and Emperor Diocletian attempted to solve the inflation crisis in 301 AD by imposing his edict on maximum prices, which set caps on over 1,400 goods and services with the death penalty for violators. 4 years later, the edict had failed completely. Modern America presents a similar pattern. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet stood at approximately $900 billion in December 2007 before the financial crisis, and by 2022 it had peaked at $8.9 trillion, which represents a 7-fold expansion in 14 years. M2 money supply, a measure of money circulating in the economy, jumped from $15.5 trillion in January 2020 to a peak of $21.7 trillion in 2022. That's a 40% increase in just 2 years, with a peak growth rate of 26.9% year over year in February 2021, the highest since modern records began in 1959. Both empires printed their way out of immediate crises. Whether that means America is doomed to repeat Rome's fate is the real question. A British military officer named Sir John Bagot Glubb published a 26-page essay in 1976 called The Fate of Empires and Search for Survival, and though he'd commanded Jordan's Arab Legion, for 17 years he wasn't an academic historian. His essay, published without references or footnotes, made a bold claim that empires last approximately 250 years. 11 empires went into his study, and he claimed this pattern held across 3,000 years of history. America, founded in 1776, turns exactly 250 years old on July 4th, 2026. The theory sounds compelling until you examine Glubb's own data, and that's when it falls apart. Consider the Ottoman Empire, which Glubb dates from 1320 to 1570, exactly 250 years. Convenient timing. The Ottoman Empire actually lasted from 1299 to 1922, which means 623 years of history. Glubb simply stopped counting in 1570 to make his thesis work, and 350 additional years of Ottoman history got ignored in the process. Duration varies wildly across actual empires. The Byzantine Empire lasted roughly 100 years from 330 to 1453 AD. Ancient Egypt persisted for approximately 3,000 years across various dynasties. The Holy Roman Empire endured for 844 years, and the Chinese Han Dynasty lasted 400 years. Professor Peter Saris at Cambridge University called the 250-year empire claim pure fantasy, and the work receives no citations in peer-reviewed historical literature and gets no teaching time in university history programs. Professional historians reject simple cyclical theories because they suffer from selection bias, arbitrary dating decisions, and definitional problems about what constitutes an empire's beginning and end. Glubb himself admitted he excluded India, China, and South America because he knows nothing about them, which represents a massive omission for a supposedly universal pattern. If the 250-year theory lacks academic support, what should actually concern us about 2026? A widely circulated claim states that interest payments on the national debt will exceed defense spending in 2026, and here's where we need to update that information. According to the Congressional Budget Office's January 2025 report, that threshold got crossed in fiscal year 2025, which means it already happened. The numbers tell a stark story. Fiscal year 2025 saw the United States pay $970 billion in net interest on the national debt, while national defense spending came in at $917 billion, which means interest payments now exceed defense spending by $53 billion annually. Projections from the Congressional Budget Office show annual interest payments reaching $1.8 trillion by 2035, representing 4.1% of GDP. Over the next 10 years, from 2026 to 2035, the United States will pay a cumulative $13.8 trillion just in interest. National debt stood at $38.4 trillion as of November 2025, growing at approximately $6.12 billion per day, or $2.23 trillion year over year. Debt to GDP ratio hit 100%, approaching the post-World War II peak of 106% in 1946. By 2029, projections show it exceeding that World War II record, and by 2035, it could reach 118%. Context matters here. In 1974, US debt to GDP sat at just 23%, and in 2008, before the financial crisis, it measured 40.5%. The transformation happened fast. Economic collapse isn't necessarily inevitable, but peacetime America has never been in this territory before. Around the year 100 AD, a Roman poet named Juvenal wrote a satirical work criticizing his fellow citizens, and in Satire X, he lamented that the Roman people, who once held the power to elect officials and command legions, had given up their civic duties and anxiously hoped for just two things: bread and circuses. The phrase panem et circenses has become shorthand for government distraction through free food and entertainment. But here's the critical context that gets missed. Juvenal was criticizing the citizens, not the government, lamenting the loss of republican virtue and the decline of civic engagement. Rome's grain dole, known as the annona, began in 123 BC as subsidized grain and became free distribution in 58 BC. Under Augustus, approximately 200,000 adult male citizens received monthly allotments of wheat, roughly 1 in 5 Romans in the city, and the program continued until the Western Empire fell in 476 AD. Modern America shows similar patterns. Fiscal year 2024 saw the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program serve 41.7 million recipients, representing 12.3% of the population, at a cost of $99.8 billion. Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid combined account for roughly 50% of all federal spending. The entertainment and recreation industry generates $518.5 billion annually. The average American adult spends over 7 hours daily on screens, and more than 50% of teenagers exceed 4 hours of daily screen time. The parallel appears obvious at first: welfare and entertainment as societal opiates. Whether that's what actually destroyed Rome is a different question entirely. Professor Alexander Demant catalogued more than 200 different hypotheses for why Rome fell in 1984, and modern scholarship rejects the idea that any single factor, whether economic, military, or cultural, was solely responsible. Pandemic diseases like the Antonine Plague get emphasized by Professor Kyle Harper at the University of Oklahoma, since the plague possibly killed half the population between 165 and 180 AD. And he also points to climate change during the late antique Little Ice Age. Professor Peter Heather at Oxford focuses on barbarian invasions, particularly pressure from the Huns forcing Germanic tribes across Roman borders. Material collapse gets documented by Professor Brian Ward Perkins, also at Oxford, showing how pottery production ceased in Britain and living standards fell below pre-Roman Iron Age levels. Ward Perkins noted on the economic factors specifically that the key internal element in Rome's success or failure was the economic well-being of its taxpayers, because the empire relied for its security on a professional army, which in turn relied on adequate funding. Even he presents this as one factor among many, rather than the sole cause. Multiple crises compounded each other. The crisis of the 3rd century from 235 to 284 AD saw 26 different claimants to the throne. The Gothic crossing of the Danube in 376 AD marked a pivotal turning point, and the Vandals captured North Africa in 439 AD, cutting off Rome's grain supply. Rome didn't fall because of a math problem. Multiple systems failed simultaneously over centuries. Professor Václav Smil at the University of Manitoba wrote an entire book arguing against the Rome-America parallels, and his central point is that superficial similarities do not imply identical outcomes. Wood and muscle power fueled Rome while America runs on fossil fuels. Roman life expectancy hovered around 35 years compared to Americans living to approximately 80. Rome's economy was primarily agrarian, while today 78.5% of the US workforce operates in services. Romans, as Smil notes, were neither impressive inventors nor leading technical innovators, and American technological advancement is unmatched in human history. The US dollar remains the world's reserve currency, used in 88% of foreign exchange transactions, which might be the most significant difference. Former IMF chief economist Olivier Blanchard argues that when safe interest rates remain below growth rates, debt dynamics differ fundamentally from historical crises. Japan maintains a 235% debt to GDP ratio without collapse, though the Federal Reserve warns against using Japan as a direct predictor since Japanese debt is 88% domestically held with artificially suppressed rates. None of this means American debt is sustainable or without consequences. The comparison to Rome is more rhetorical than analytically precise. The Roman citizen in 400 AD believed their empire was eternal, and they were wrong since within 76 years the Western Empire would cease to exist. Their downfall didn't come from hitting a predetermined 250-year limit or making a single mathematical error, and instead, multiple compounding crises overwhelmed institutional capacity over centuries. America in 2026 faces legitimate fiscal concerns. Interest payments exceeding defense spending isn't a trivial milestone, and the $38.4 trillion national debt growing at $6 billion daily demands serious policy responses. Real problems require real solutions. History is not a blueprint that repeats in predictable cycles. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy states that historical outcomes are not determined by a few large-scale causes, and instead, multiple local, contingent, and conjunctural processes jointly come together. America in 2026 is not Rome in 400 AD. Similarities are real but limited. Differences are vast and consequential, and whether American institutions can adapt to fiscal reality remains an open question that will be answered by policy choices rather than historical inevitability. The music may be playing, but we're not locked into Rome's dance.